The snow had not finished settling on his grave when she turned up at the gate of the biggest ranch in Cold Pine. She was 31 years old. She weighed less than the saddle on the horse she had been riding for 3 days. Her name was Clara Brenner, and she had not cried in 47 days, which she counted as both her greatest accomplishment and her gravest sin. The horse she rode had been borrowed from a preacher who had stopped asking questions the moment he saw her hands shake. Before we go further, settle in wherever you are tonight. Some of you are at the kitchen table with the radio on. Some of you are in the rocking chair by the window. Some of you are pulling quilting thread through dark cotton and trying not to think about a man you have lost. Let us know in the comments where you are listening from. We love knowing who is with us. The gatekeeper raised a hand. We don't hire women out here, ma'am. Best turn around. I am not here to be hired, she said. I'm here to see Mr. Asher Thorne. The name made the man's chin tighten. Nobody asked for Asher Thorne. People either worked for him, owed him, or stayed out of his sight. He had built his operation out of nothing in 20 years, in a territory where men's fortunes were made and unmade in a single winter. He was a man you heard about long before you saw him, the way you hear about weather coming across a flat country. He's not receiving. He will receive me. Her voice did not rise. It did not waver. It had been worn down to a flat, certain sound by the same weeks that had worn the calluses on her palms. Tell him Clara Brenner is here with the deed to the Burroughs place. He'll know what that means. The gatekeeper looked at her long enough to memorize the cracks in her face, the lines at the corners of her mouth, the way her lower lip had been bitten till it bled every day since January, and the way she had stopped biting it because she had begun to need that blood for something else. He noticed the small paper pinned to the inside of her coat, folded over twice. He turned his horse. He was gone a long time. Clara had buried her husband, Jonah Brenner, on the 7th of January. He had been 34. He had died on a Tuesday from the inside out, the way a man dies when his lungs forget what winter air tastes like. He had coughed blood into a handkerchief and folded the square 4 times and set it on the table and looked at her and said, I am sorry I cannot make this last the way I meant to. She had not answered him. She had not been able to. By the time she could have, the silence had grown so heavy that answering felt like breaking something that should be kept whole. The handkerchief had stayed on the table. She had not washed it. She had not thrown it away either. She had folded it a 5th time and put it in the small wooden box that held her wedding ribbon and her mother's last letter. And she had put the box on the high shelf and had not looked at it since. They had been married 7 years. They had owned 14 acres, a sway-backed milk cow, a chicken house, and a graveyard plot her grandfather-in-law had paid for before the war. The Burroughs place adjoined them to the east. It was 160 acres of good grass and water rights, abandoned 4 years before Clara was born by a man named Hollis Kane. Kane had mortgaged it for silver mining money, lost every cent of it, and had spent the 2 decades since then building an empire on the bones of other people's failed dreams. He owned every lawyer in Canaan. He owned 3 of the 4 men who sat on the bench. He owned the water that ran downhill. 3 weeks after the funeral, a man from the bank in Canaan had ridden out to the Burroughs cabin. He had handed Clara an envelope with 2 fingers, the way you hand a thing to someone you do not want to touch. Inside the envelope was a notice that the Burroughs place was being sold for back taxes, the sum of $42.12. Inside the notice, in Hollis Kane's own neat and arrogant handwriting, was a small note that read, I shall take possession at the end of the month, with my compliments. Jonah had been carrying a small deed to the Burroughs place in his breast pocket for 11 years. He had inherited it from an uncle who had died in his sleep and had willed it to the first brave soul who would work it. Jonah had never gotten around to filing it. He had meant to. He had always meant to. And now he was under the ground, the deed still folded against his heart in the chest pocket of the wool coat his mother had made for him in 1879, and Clara was holding it in her hand as if it were the last piece of him still warm. She had 2 choices. She could let it go. She could walk into Canaan, find a room above the laundry, and try to forget that she had ever owned a thing of her own. Or she could ride 3 days through January cold and stand at the gate of the richest cattleman in the territory, the only man in 10 counties rich enough and stubborn enough to fight Hollis Kane, until he listened. She had chosen the second one. She had ridden 3 days without once stopping to eat. She had chewed willow bark for the headache and river water for the thirst, and her own tongue for courage. And when she had stepped down from the saddle at the gate of Cold Pine, her boots had worn through at the sole, and her stockings had been soaked with blood that was not entirely her own. When Asher Thorne rode up to the gate, he was not what she had pictured. He was 51. He was lean in the way men become lean when work has eaten their softness. His hair was iron gray. He wore black because he had been wearing black for 4 winters, because 4 winters ago he had buried his wife beside the first son he had ever lost. He moved his horse closer slowly, the way a man approaches a horse he is not sure of. She did not look away from him. She said, "I buried my husband last winter." Asher Thorne removed his hat and held it against his chest. He did not say a word. The wind moved down the valley and lifted the brim of the hat he was holding. And for a long moment there was nothing in the world but the two of them and the snow and the sound that the snow made coming down. Then he nodded his head once, the way a man nods when he has understood something that another person will spend their whole life trying to say. "Get down from that horse," he said. "You have come too far to be sitting on it." She got down. Her legs almost buckled. He did not offer his arm. He did not step forward to catch her. He simply walked beside her at a pace her body could match, the way a man walks beside a girl at her first dance, knowing the floor will hold them both, and did not look back at her once until they had reached the kitchen door. Pearl was waiting inside. Pearl was the housekeeper. She was a small woman of about 60 who had outlived 2 husbands and a daughter, and whose face had been worn into a look of permanent, unhurried appraisal. She set a bowl of stew on the table and a cup of coffee in Clara's hand without asking a single question, then went back to her bread. It was the smallest kindness Clara had received in 7 weeks, and it almost cost her the composure she had been keeping for the past 47 days. She did not let it cost her. She kept her face still and her voice level, and she ate every drop of the stew, because she had learned in 7 weeks that pride is a luxury the hungry cannot afford. "I will tell you everything I need," she said that evening, standing by the fire in his study without sitting down, because sitting down would feel like folding herself smaller than she had been 3 days ago. "But first I will tell you the part that matters most." Asher Thorne sat behind his desk. He did not interrupt. He had not interrupted a person who needed to speak in 48 months. His wife had died speaking. He had carved that silence into himself the way you carve a notch in a doorframe, and he had promised nobody he would ever let a person die speaking if he could help it. "Your wife," Clara said. "I do not know her name, but I know that you buried her. I know that you have been wearing black for 4 winters. I know that you have not been seen in town by daylight in all that time. And I know that you are the only man in this territory who has more power than Hollis Kane and less interest in using it." He looked at her. He did not confirm her. He did not deny her. He lifted the paper on his desk and began to read it, which was his way of granting her the floor. She told him the rest. She told him of the deed. She told him of the unpaid taxes. She told him of Kane's intention to fence the creek and how every homestead downstream, his own homestead included, would lose its water by midsummer if he did. She told him of Jonah, and of how kind Jonah had been, and of how kindness had killed him as surely as the sickness in his chest. She told him of the handkerchief she had not thrown away. Asher listened. When she had finished, he said, "Why didn't he file the deed himself?" She said, "He kept thinking the next month would be quieter. The next season would be kinder. The next year would have less to do. And now you are here. And now I am here." He looked at the fire a long time. Then he said, "I have one question, Miss Brenner. If Kane takes the Burroughs place, will your own 14 acres survive?" "For 1 year," she said. "If there is no rain, if the creek goes dry, if somebody does not stand in his way, and you want me to be the one who stands in his way, I want you to do it for the creek." He said, "That is the second time you have said the creek and not yourself." "Yes," she said. "The creek can be saved. My husband cannot." He did not answer. He stood up and walked to the window and stood there looking out at his own land, thinking about a piece of land he did not own, and about a woman who had not asked him for herself. A man has 2 ways he can stand in a fight, and one of them costs nothing, and one of them costs you a piece of yourself you will never get back. She was offering him the second one, and he knew it, and she knew he knew it, and that was the only honest word that had been spoken between them in 4 months. By sundown the household had begun to whisper. The foreman, a raw-boned man named Briggs, said outright that Asher had no business making war on Hollis Kane over the fuss of a widow from the North Road. 2 of the hands quit before supper and rode east toward the smoke of Cain's operation, because Cain paid an honest dollar and Asher paid the kind of dollar that got a man killed. Pearl said nothing to anyone, but she made up the spare room without being asked. She set a bowl of stew and a folded napkin outside Clara's door. She did this the way a woman does it when she intends for the guest to stay. Clara unpacked the small bag she had carried from home. She laid Jonah's shirt across the chair. She laid his spare socks in the drawer. She laid the ribbon from her own wedding next to them, because she could not bring herself to wear it and could not bring herself to leave it behind. She set Jonah's shaving mug on the washstand. She set the small Bible he had been reading at the end inside the drawer, marked to the page he had been reading when the cough took him. On the second morning, when she went down to the kitchen, there was a small sprig of pine laid across the table next to her plate. She did not ask whose doing it was. She took it as it was meant, as a quiet word from a man who had forgotten how to speak, put it in her apron pocket, and carried it back to the spare room and laid it across the Bible in the drawer. By the third day, riders had been spotted on the ridge north of the property. They carried Cain's brand on their saddle leather. They carried rifles. They carried word. Pearl set her spoon down when she heard it and looked at Clara a long moment. "Ma'am," she said, "you are planning war on a man who has more lawyers than friends." "I am planning water," said Clara. "War is his idea, not mine. What would you have done in her place? Would you have ridden 3 days to the gate of the richest man in the territory, or would you have let the creek go for the sake of peace? We would love to hear what you would have done in the comments." Hollis Cain did not come down himself at first. He sent 2 men with papers. The papers said Clara was a trespasser on her own land. The papers said the deed she carried was forged. The papers said her husband had been a known drunk who had signed away every acre to his creditors in his last months of illness. The papers also named Asher Thorne as an accomplice and threatened him with charges of fraud, conspiracy, and the harboring of a dangerous woman. Clara read every word of the papers. Then she handed them back to the rider and said, "Tell your boss the creek will be free, or he will know where I hid the gun." The rider went back pale. Cain did not laugh when he heard the message. He laughed the following week, when he rode up himself with 6 men behind him and 1 in front of him, and tipped his silver hatband to Asher on the porch and said, "I believe we have a misunderstanding, neighbor." Asher stepped out. Clara stood behind him. Pearl had tried to make her stay inside. Clara had refused. She stood just over Asher's shoulder, in the shadow of the porch beam, and said nothing. Cain looked at her. He had not looked at a woman with any seriousness in 20 years. He looked at her the way a man looks at a child who has spoken out of turn in church, the way a man looks at something small. "Little lady," he said, "your husband's name is mud from here to the Arkansas." "My husband's name," Clara said, "is written in the county clerk's office in Canaan, in a deed witnessed by 2 men still alive in Cold Pine. You have not thought to look. Ma'am, you will address me by my name," she said, "or you will not address me at all." Something shifted in Asher's face. Not much. A 1/4 inch at the corner of his mouth. He had not known he could be impressed anymore, by anything, by any living soul, in this territory or any other. Cain tried one more time. "The deed is 12 years old, Mrs. Brenner. The statute of frauds." "The deed," Clara said, "was witnessed by Eli Marsh and Tom Farrar. They will say what they saw. They will sign their names again. And a jury will hear them, because we will not let this settle in some lawyer's back room." Cain laughed. It was a thin, dry laugh, the kind a man makes when he is certain of his own victory and has forgotten what it feels like to be wrong. He tipped his hat to her, and he rode off. 6 men with rifles behind him. He was not worried. He had never lost a fight he could afford to lose. That winter, on the 3rd night after that porch meeting, they set fire to the east corner of Asher's land. The flames climbed the dry grass up the ridge. Sparks flew over the cottonwoods by the creek like a swarm of burning bees. The hands fought it until dawn. Clara fought it beside them, passing water with her own hands, singing nothing, breathing smoke until her voice was gone. She did not faint. She did not sit down. When the last of the grass had been beaten out, she walked back to the cabin porch with her sleeves rolled to the elbow and her forearms black with soot. Asher was sitting on the top step. He had a bottle of water in his hand. He had been waiting for her. He took off his hat when she sat down beside him. He had begun doing that around her. He had not done it for any woman since his wife. "I should tell you something," he said, after a long quiet. I did not come to fight Hollis Kane for the creek. Clara looked at him. I came because my son Ethan rode for Kane. 3 winters ago. He was 19. He thought Kane was going to give him a spread of his own. He was wrong. Asher looked at the smoldering ridge. Kane had him killed for $30. He said my son had stolen from a drawer in a saloon. Clara did not say she was sorry. She had not apologized to anyone since January, and she did not think he was a man who needed the word. She sat with him on the step and looked at the black line of the burn across the hill. The smell of burned earth and ash rose off the grass in slow waves, and the sky over the ridge was orange with what was left of the fire. "Do you know why I came?" she said after a time. "I think," he said. "I do. Because I could not let another woman," she said, "ride 3 days in January and stand at a gate and find no one inside who had ever loved the way she had loved." He lifted the water bottle to her. She took it. They passed it back and forth a long time without speaking, and neither of them noticed when the orange in the sky faded to the first gray of dawn. In the morning, when she came down to the kitchen, there was a sprig of pine at her place again, and beside it a small flat stone with a single word on it, carved by a knife, in a man's careful and unhurried hand. The word was still. Pearl watched them from the corner of the kitchen. She said nothing. She had outlived 2 husbands and a daughter and had learned that love, when it comes back sideways, through a door you did not think to lock. If this story is moving you tonight, you are exactly who we wrote it for. A like and a subscribe tells us to keep going. The trial was held in the courthouse at Canaan in the first week of April. The room smelled of wet wool and lamp oil and unwashed boots. The sun came in through the high windows and slanted bars and lay across the unpainted floorboards. Eli Marsh came in with a cane, leaning on it the way a man leans on something he has carried too long to put down. Tom Farrar came in without one, but he held the back of the pew the way a man holds the back of a pew when his knees have begun to fail him. They remembered Jonah Brenner. They remembered signing the deed. They remembered the year, and the smell of the ink, and the man who had brought the deed out to them with his hat in his hands. The lawyer for Hollis Kane tried to shake them. He tried to confuse the year. He tried to confuse the signatures. He tried to confuse the smell of the ink, and the weather, and the man who had held the pen. He could not. They were too old, and old men who remember ink are dangerous in a courtroom. They were made of the same kind of certainty that buries a man's family in a single winter and does not let him forget. Clara did not weep when the judge ruled the deed was valid and the sale for taxes was unlawful. She did not smile. She nodded once, the way a woman nods when she has been carrying a thing so long that putting it down feels almost like losing it. She lifted her hand slightly, the way a woman lifts her hand when she is trying to set down a child she has been holding in her arms for too long. She let it settle on the pew rail in front of her, and she did not let go of her face. Asher stood behind her in the gallery. He was wearing a dark blue shirt. He had not owned a dark blue shirt in 4 winters. Pearl had ordered it special from Denver without being asked, and she had wrapped it in brown paper and set it on his bed with her 2 hands and a face that gave nothing away. Hollis Kane lost every dollar of the borough's sale. He lost every dollar of the fines the court imposed. He lost his lawyer's fees, and the lawyers lost their willingness to be seen with him on the street. And by the end of May, when the bank that had carried his paper saw what the court had done, they foreclosed on him the way a man pulls a tooth, slowly, with a clamp, and without ever telling him when they were going to do it. The house he had built on the hill above Cold Pine was sold at auction in June, for 1/20th of what he had built it for, to a young couple from Kansas who had been waiting 2 years for a place of their own. The silver hat band went for $58 to a jeweler in Denver who knew exactly what it was worth, and who carried it home in a small velvet bag and did not mention to his wife where he had gotten it. The creek ran free by the middle of June. Asher bought the Burroughs place at the end of the summer fair. He paid cash. He walked the deed up to Clara's porch in the evening of the second Saturday of August, when the evening air smelled of hay and of the first cut grass on the higher meadows. He did not ask her to marry him. He did not kneel. He did not say the word. He simply held the deed and his hat out at the same time, the way a man holds out the 2 things he has left to give, and he said, "The creek is yours. The Burroughs place is yours. The 14 acres will always be yours. And so will I, for as long as you want what I am offering." She did not answer for a long time. She set the coffee cup down. She set her own hat down. She stood on the porch step beside him and looked at the ridge where the fire had been, and she looked at the cottonwoods by the creek where the new leaves had come in green and trembling, and she looked for a long moment at the corner of the property where her husband's grave had settled into the earth. She took the deed in one hand. She took the hat in the other. She said, "I want what you are offering." "Then I will stay," he said. "Then I will stop counting the days," she said. He did not answer. There was nothing to add to that. Pearl, watching from the kitchen window, set her hand on the flour canister and did not move it for a long time. Epilogue. It was the second spring after. Clara walked out to the wooden porch of the Burrows' cabin at sunup. She had replanted her husband's kitchen garden the week before. There were peas coming up in 3 tidy rows, and a cabbage she had set out herself, and a corner of onion that the wind had not taken. There was a fence she had stained herself, with a small gate at the end that opened out toward the path that ran down to the creek. There was a horse at the rail whose brand had not been Asher's until the previous autumn, and which she had accepted as her own the way one accepts a small habitual kindness from a man who has run out of grand gestures. Asher was leaning on the porch rail. He had come over at dawn to help her mend the cellar door. He was wearing the dark blue shirt again. He would wear it every spring for the rest of his life. He had stopped counting winters. He had taken off his hat when he saw her come out the door, and he had forgotten to put it back on, and he had not noticed she had not handed it to him yet. She set a cup of coffee against his hand. He took it without turning to look, the way a man takes a thing from a woman whose hands he knows the shape of in the dark. "You know," she said, watching the creek catch the first of the light, "the things you give up on have a strange way of finding you." He did not answer her. There was nothing to add to that. The light came up over the ridge. The creek ran. The peas were coming up. And somewhere, under the snow that had finally melted from the small hill at the corner of the property, Jonah Brenner's grave had settled into the earth the way a man's family does when the world has stopped asking anything of them. Next, we will tell the story of a mute boy who inherited a dead man's cattle empire at the age of 15, and the schoolmarm who learned his language before anyone else knew he was speaking. We hope you will be with us for that one.